This warrior apparently thinks her breasts are a couple of bits of dough that he needs to pound into submission before baking in a hot oven. Oh, hello there, my loves. It's wonderful of you to come back and join me on this wonderful Friday morning. Of course, I'm recording this the day before, but you get the idea. I hope you've all had a lovely week. Today, I'm going to be reviewing 4 bloody books. Can you believe it? I'm trying to clear the backlog. Got lots of books that I've been reading and haven't been reviewing because I've been doing other things. The salient points of each one will hopefully be there, but the larger part of what I would have probably said have been lost to the sands of time because my mind is slowly turning to shit. But yeah, hopefully you'll get something out of them. There may be various noises in the background because some bastard is operating heavy machinery in my vicinity and seems to do on a daily fucking basis, the bastard. Anyway, let's calm down. Let's cool your tits. Right, here we go. The first one, well, I'm going to do it in the order that I'll be reviewing them and in the order that I read them. So back in the sands of time, that was probably February, I read this one, The Swordsmistress of Chaos by Richard Kirk. Bit of sword and sorcery to start us off. Then it's Freaky Deaky by Elmore Leonard. This one was recommended to me by Nookie Nelson. Thoroughly enjoyed that one. Then we've got the Amtrak Wars, the first book, Cloud Warrior, recommended again by Brian, mate of mine in the real world, by Patrick Tilley. And the last one will be an ebook, a novella by one of the regulars of this channel, actually, Will Waw. What is it called? The Mouth of Hell. So it's a kind of a zombie, apocalyptic zombie thing. But anyway, we'll get to that when we get to it. Let's begin at the beginning with Swordsmistress of Chaos. So here it is. I'll stick the scan up there. That's my cover. This cover scanned. Right, this is the Corgi edition. This was originally published in 1978. I think this is a paperback of the same year. Yes, it is, 1978. And it's got a quite titillating cover, I think you'll agree. This is back when you could get away with putting exposed breasts on covers, it would seem, because each book of this 5-book series has a titty on it, barring one, which instead of having a titty has an exposed buttocks of the young swordmistress. Right, so Richard Kirk is actually a pseudonym for a couple of authors. So what is it, Angus Wells and Robert Holdstock. I'm not sure how they collaborated or who wrote the lion's share, but I think it was probably Angus Wells. But I've got no knowledge of his writing other than this. But he collaborated with a lot of other authors and used a number of other pseudonyms. Seemed to be his kind of shtick. I have no idea why. Yeah, perhaps one of you can tell me. So, yeah, let's go back to the cover by Chris Archilles. I mentioned him back along when I did the book haul of these Corgi editions of this series. Fantastic image. I first came across it actually in the bedroom of my uncle when I was a child. That sounds really dodgy, but he was a collector of fantasy art, so he had a number of prints up on the walls. One of my absolute favourites, Ilion of Garathorn, off the Michael Moorcock Elric novels, done by Rodney Matthews, which I've got a print in the other room, signed by the artist himself, who I actually talked to once as well on the phone. He wasn't very happy because I somehow managed to get his phone number from his agent back in the 90s, and he was a bit miffed. Almost put me off him for life. But he wasn't too bad, he was just slightly grumpy. Anyway, I'm going off piste here. But yeah, an absolutely wonderful image. And if you believe the folklore surrounding the video, Kate Bush's Babushka, well, there has to be an influence there because it inspired that video, her warrior attire. Let's have a little clip of it. Yes, of course it was inspired by that. It's almost a direct copy. other than the fact that Kate Bush's titty is not exposed. Yes, I don't think that would be very seemly in a music video, but there we are. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful stuff. So, right, what is Swordsmistress of Chaos all about? So, yeah, this kicks off the series, the 5-book series. What's she called? Raven. I think she goes by the name of Raven throughout this book, probably. I've already forgotten. Brilliant. Yes, she's called Raven. It took me ages to find her name, but I just wanted to get it right. I wanted you to know the exact details. Yeah, Raven, funnily enough. So, yeah, this is, at the very beginning of the book, we discover that she is a former sex slave, it appears to be, and she's escaped her tormentor. She finds herself taken in by this band of roguish marauders headed by, well, there's one Argor, I think he is. He's a kind of brutish barbarian bugger who wants to, as you can probably imagine, wants to bed her straight away, whether she wants it or not. But she doesn't go there. That doesn't happen. Thank goodness. She's a very strong woman, and she's a fucking warrior as well. Not at the beginning, though. I mean, they train her. So this is the melding of the warrior woman, if you will. The de facto leader, in effect, is a kind of a magician warrior called Spellbinder. Now, he prevents anything unseemly happening to Raven at the beginning, and takes her into the fold of his tent and shags her. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous, but she's the one that decides to go there, if you will. So this really is, it's sword and sorcery. It's a vehicle really for the occasional sex scene, but that isn't. There's only perhaps 3 sex scenes in the whole thing, so it's not gratuitous. It's not a piece of, you know, pulpy erotic nerd fest shit. It's sparing, and it's not too bad. It's the scenes, they don't need to be there, don't get me wrong. Whoever wrote this pair of chaps, it didn't need to be there, but I think they're probably, you know, they're considering the audience that were probably going to be buying these with an exposed breast on the front, and they probably wanted a bit of shagging in there. In fact, I will read you a segment of one of these sex scenes if you really want me to. Okay, so this is her second conquest. So she's definitely in control of these liaisons, shall we say. And this one, she's bedding a giant warrior Viking bastard, and she's already straddled him. So she's on top of him. Right, I'll just read one paragraph. I haven't read it. I just know that it's part of the sex area. Okay, Raven smiled, enjoying the power she exercised over his body, and moved into his arms. I know she hadn't straddled him yet. He circled her hips as she stood above him, pressing ardent lips to her firm breasts, her belly, her thighs. A moan formed deep in her throat as she felt his tongue, her own desire mounting so that she fell across him, pushing him down into the fur-decked bed. Slowly, despite her passion, she began to caress his body, lips and tongue tracing the contours of the scars he wore like battle honours, working downwards from neck to waist, then lower still. His manhood filled her, near choking her, though so great was her desire that she took him in until he gasped and thrust against her. His hands, powerful yet gentle, took her breasts, kneading, stroking, until she cried out and lifted up to straddle him. Okay, you get the idea there. This warrior apparently thinks her breasts are a couple of bits of dough that he needs to pound into submission before baking in a hot oven. But other than that, yeah, that's the kind of fare you're getting. It's not pornographic, but it's nothing really to write home about. What I hoped from with this book and those that followed was a kind of rip-roaring yarn, a fast-paced, pulpy adventure sword and sorcery, you know, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, the ingredients were there, but the writing really slowed it down. The writing was quite turgid. It was a bit overdone. In fact, it seemed as though the authors had kind of pretensions towards a higher form of writing, perhaps, a more literary style that didn't really marry very well with this pulpy idea. There's only so much you can do with a warrior that's going around fighting, shagging and adventuring. It's pretty basic stuff. That said, there were some interesting locations dotted around. The one that really stays with me is they had to climb down into this ravine, I suppose. It's in the middle of nowhere in the far south of the map. There is a map in this book, which is wonderful. And the bottom of this canyon is populated by a rainforest. I've never encountered really rainforests in fantasy before that I can remember. Anyway, they trudge through this thing and it's just crawling with nasty stuff, and also these kind of half wolf, half human monstrosities that are trying to kill them all the time. And then in the middle there's this old temple that a spellbinder goes in to try and get this relic, this skull that has some power. It's all that kind of thing. Go here, find that, go there, shag that kind of thing, if you will. But there we are. It was okay, but it didn't really make me want to jump straight onto the second book, because I knew I'd be wading through that kind of turgid mess again. But I will read further, I'm sure. Yes, I mean, just going back to the sex scenes, I mean, yeah, there's 3 that I remember, but the last one is gratuitously unnecessary, and it involves a lesbian encounter. So this is definitely wish fulfillment stuff. And it didn't have a massive bearing on what happened. I think she was trying to win over this princess or something, and then ended up, luckily for her, the princess was a lesbian, and Raven up to this point had never considered dallying with another girl. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. Anyway, let's bring the devil down and give it a rating. Right, I'm going to give this, I'll give it 3 out of 5. But it was very nearly 2 out of 5, just because I found it quite tedious to wade through. But there was enough there of interest that kept me going. But yeah, if you ever give it a go, it's a bit of a slog. What do you think of the cover? I mean, it's not for everyone, obviously, but this original Corgi edition, these Corgi editions, of which I've got all 5 of them, are very expensive now. So I think this first one goes for around £20, which, as many of you know, is absolutely bonkers for a book from the late 70s with a story that's not that brilliant. But there we are. Well, I'm a collector at heart, and I wanted that particular version. I wonder why. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, next up, it's Freaky Deaky. This is my cover. I was a bit disappointed when this arrived. It was the same old thing I ordered from World of Books on eBay. It was stock. Normally, the stock ones do reference the ones you get, the stock images. But the one that it showed was a far more interesting cover. But they gave me this one, which is sun-bleached and, well, just disappointing, really. But I'll find a couple of nice ones and sling them up there as well. So yeah, this was recommended to me by Nucky Nelson when I was asking for book recommendations. And he said at the time that Quentin Tarantino is a big fan of this writer. And you can tell right from the get-go that this is where Quentin Tarantino gets his juice from. Reading this was like watching a Tarantino film. It had the same kind of humour, the same kind of convoluted story interwoven with lots of different characters and shifting viewpoints, and very intelligently written. Lots of interesting vernacular of the place and time. So it's set in Detroit. That's the first thing to say, in contemporary Detroit of 1988. This is when the book was released. I think the book itself is it's set in 86, something like that. And it was really interesting. This is just a side point that normally, or when I used to read before the internet existed, you know, you'd read about places and you have to form your own ideas about what something looks like, you know, a particular monument or a church or whatever. But of course now we can, this is a massive change, of course, we can look on the internet and find out what these various places look like. So I went on Street View and things like that, and I was looking around just to give it a bit more source in my mind and to increase the filmic value, if you will, for my imagination. I know that's not groundbreaking revelation. I think we can all do that, but I often forget that we can do that, you know. I suddenly, you know, I put the book down for, I can look that up. I sound like a right old twat now, don't I? Anyway, so, right, what's the book about? So this is largely following a chap called Chris, who's a policeman. And we meet him on the last day of his current job, which is working for like a bomb disposal unit, if you will, for the Detroit police. It's his last day, and what does he encounter but some chap, I was going to say a poor chap, but I think he's probably a bastard, like a drug dealer, drug gang leader, I suppose. Anyway, he's sat on a chair that has been rigged to explode. So underneath his seat there's a load of dynamite. So yeah, he picked up the phone, and I think it's his girlfriend told him that you need to sit down. So he sits down on this chair and then says, right, when you get up, you're gonna die, you're gonna explode. So Chris is on the scene to try to dismantle that with Jerry, I think it is, his mate. And they take one look at it and think, well, bloody hell, this is gonna be a tricky one to dismantle. So they say to him, right, just chill for a bit. We're going to go out. So they just go out for a smoke. And this is Tarantino to a T. This is right at the beginning. This is a spoiler of sorts, but it's wonderful. It's such a wonderful scene. It made me laugh. And so they're having a conversation that's not actually directly about this poor chap's situation. They're talking about something else. And then suddenly there's this massive explosion. And they know, we all know what's happened, but they don't even break a stride. They just finish their conversation. That is just wonderful scene to set it all up. So yeah, dynamite features heavily in this story, and it's largely about this young woman, a former kind of reactionary political activist called Robin. And so back in the day, back in the 70s, she was the type that would, she did various things, protests, but some naughty things as well, blowing stuff up and that kind of stuff. And she served time for it. Her and her mate, he's called Skip, he's the bomb expert. He's a drug addict, really. Likes to take acid all the time. Bit of a frazzled chap. So she enlists his help, and what she wants to do is extort this these two brothers, rich brothers, that by all accounts are really, really wealthy. They've got millions. And so, yeah, so we've got that. We've got these rich brothers. We've got them, these two former activists. We've got lots of dynamite, and we've got Chris, the policeman, and a number of other players. And so these stories are all, these perspectives and situations are all interwoven into one big story. This was actually made into a film, I think it was 2012. I'd never seen it, but yeah, Quentin Tarantino, if he had done this, it would have been one of his films. But yeah, that's where he must get his juice from. One of the things I thought was, reading this, I can't imagine writing this. I can't imagine how it was written. I mean, it's so complicated. It must have been planned out to a certain degree. But I love the way people spoke and the kind of nicknames people had. There's this chap that I think was the one that set up his boss, the boss that went kaboom. And he's called Juicy Mouth. It's just such a wonderful nickname because he's got a massive tongue. Just wonderful. And there's lots of little tidbits here and there. I loved it. I really loved it. So let's get the devil down. I'll tell you what, let's give this one 5 out of 5. It's one of the best things I've read this year, other than The Blade itself, which is fantasy. But yeah, I absolutely loved it, and I highly recommend reading this one particularly. But I'm also going to search out some of his other books. Really loved it. Okay, next up, The Amtrak Wars, the first book, Cloud Warrior by Patrick Tilley. I'll probably stick other covers up here like last time. This actually is, so this isn't my book. Brian's lent me the whole lot. So I've got all 6 books back there. So what I'm going to do is intersperse other books and just carry on reading, you know, kind of stepping stone wise. This one is an original, well, a first edition paperback from the year of first publication, 1983. So yeah. And it's in lovely condition. So Brian's got a nice set there. I haven't creased it too much, old chum. Just a little bit. And I haven't folded any of the corners. I did fold one corner over. Just a tiny one. Apologies. Just a tiny little one there. But that's because I'm going to do a little reading in a moment. So, have any of you heard of this? I'm sure many of you have. I had heard of it just in the name, Amtrak Wars, but I knew nothing about it. So Brian recommended this to me because I think we were talking about Mad Max. And I was saying that I loved the use of language that had somehow survived this post-apocalyptic nuclear holocaust. So random words would be used out of context, or people would be called strange things like, I don't know, Motown, Billboard, and whatever. Yeah, I loved that side of it. And he said, well, yeah, that was probably derived from this book. So yeah, that really piqued my interest and I've really enjoyed reading it. So, right, what's it all about? So we begin by following a young kind of flight cadet called Steve. It's a fairly uninspiring name, but there we are, Steve. He's training to be a pilot of these little arrow-winged craft that we quickly realise are quite simple things. They've just got a propeller, but they are solar powered. They've got a skin that allows them to fly pretty much forever. But you realise at the very beginning that they're living underground. So this flight training that he's going through is in these massive underground caverns. And so this is part of the Amtrak Federation. So this is set 1,000 years after the nuclear holocaust, which must have happened, I guess, in the 80s. I think that's what they're going for, or perhaps not long after that. And so it seems a large portion of humanity, especially in North America, have survived underground in this. Well, they've gradually burrowed out over the last 1,000 years. They've made this massive interconnected city, lots of cities, all interconnected far under the ground to survive, to prevent exposure to the lingering radiation. So Steve leaves on a mission at some point. And so their mission is to go out and eradicate what they call lumps. I think they call them lumps. Or the plains people. They call themselves the plain people. So humanity that had to survive on the surface were obviously completely fucked over by the radiation. They're called lumps because they go around with, tumours all over their body, like bony lumps, things like that. And, some of them are more grotesquely affected than others. But yeah, these would be these kind of marauding devils from Mad Max, really. And they've had to survive up on the surface. And of course, over the course of time, they've been affected by it, but in more ways than you might realise. So the plains people have a power that you can only really call magic. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it for people that haven't read it. But interestingly, separated from technology, and I guess due to the way they've had to survive over the hundreds of years in this situation, they've been able to gather power of some kind that they assume comes from the earth to do various things. Alter the weather, that's one of the ones they can do. But there's lots of other things that defy explanation. And so, yeah, we've got these two opposing situations. The Amtrak Federation want to wipe them all out. And the Plains people just want to survive. They just want to be left alone. So we don't really know why Amtrak want to get rid of all these people, other than potentially repopulating the surface. I think that's probably the main reason. But there's definitely something else going on in the background, something darker, which you don't actually discover fully in the first book. But I think that's what unfolds as we go along. Again, so if we go back to this use of language that I love so much in the Mad Max films, in this book, it's all there. I mean, this is where it must have been derived from here. So you've got the Plains people. Steve eventually meets them. So he crash lands on one of these missions and they kind of take him as prisoner. And so he meets the two kind of leaders of this group. So there's Mr. Snow and there's Cadillac. Mr. Snow, I assume he's called Mr. Snow because he's just got white hair, and so he's got the lumps. He's got the lump affliction, and Cadillac he looks more human. There's no lumps on him, so that's an interesting point that I'm not going to go into. But yeah, he's called Cadillac. His partner, a female plainsfolk woman, is called Clearwater. But then there's other ones called like Motorhead and what's the other one? Camp David. Someone had that one. Yeah, various other names that have tarmac or whatever, a hard top, yeah, things like that have somehow persisted but lost all meaning, and so they're using them then as names. Names of power, they call them. But it's also interesting, like the names of their clans. So these nomadic plains people they're attacking each other all the time by the sounds of it. So it's also similar to Mad Max. So you had those different factions that would be, it's survival of the fittest at the end of the day. But one of the clans, or the clan that Steve encounters, is the clan of the SHE, SHE-KARGO, cargo. Chicago. Wonderful stuff. And so there's other clans that reference other cities. Seattle, I think, is another one. But all of these in the kind of north of North America. Yeah, absolutely loved that. Every time one of these names of power came up, it kind of, it gave me a little tickle. But the names of the tribes, for example, I didn't even notice at the time because of the spelling. I didn't even think about it. And then I was looking at it more closely. I thought, that's Chicago. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Yeah, so that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I won't say what happens, but I suppose it's the coming together of two opposing ideologies. So you've got he's just been fully brainwashed by the Amtrak organization to the extent that they've removed words from their vocabulary. He doesn't know what love is. He's probably never even experienced it. Lots of other things, freedom, for example, they've completely hammered all of that out of them. There's no music as such played underground. It's all about learning stuff about military indoctrination, about the necessity to kill these mutant humans on the surface, whereas the plains folk when we initially encounter them, we realize that there's a lot of barbarism going on. Nature is at full work here. It's fight or die kind of thing. There's a lot of cruelty. I mean, even the clan of the Chicago, when they kill their victims, they sever their heads and stick them on poles outside of the houses, for example, those kind of things. And there's various rituals that they associate with being a warrior that are quite intense, to say the least. But at the end of the day, they're just living. They just want to live. They want to be left alone. They're not really causing any harm. They're living in harmony and in balance with the environment. So yeah, we've got these two things going on, and there's a lot of prophecy about what's going to happen in the future. So yeah, this first book really is a setting up of what is going to be coming down the line. But yeah, really loved it all. Now, the one thing I didn't like, and it sounds like a big thing, but it's not really, but is the writing. It's well written, don't get me wrong, but it does get bogged down at times. And it just seems to me that this Patrick Tilley, he likes to nail everything down. He doesn't want to leave too much to your imagination. So, for example, the way the military was described, it felt as though perhaps he had some kind of military background himself. Everything has to be in its place, for example. And it shows in the writing, in that like something happens and it's described in excruciating detail sometimes, which isn't really needed. You're kind of wading through it and you're thinking, well, I kind of know what's happened here. I don't need to know what nuts and bolts have been removed of this thing and what it looks like upside down or whatever, if you know what I mean. It's a little bit too much like that. And some of the paragraphs are fucking huge. And for me, I'm still a bit of a shit reader in some ways. If I see massive blocks of text, it just makes me want to jump out of the nearest window. But I'm going to read one little bit here. This is one sentence, okay? Get ready. Steve and the other people on the flight deck winced with horror but watched with morbid fascination as a searing burst of brilliant orange fire ballooned outwards from the point of impact, then rolled in on itself and lifted to become a mushroom cloud of black smoke, leaving the mangled carcass of the Skyhawk silhouetted in the middle of a circle of blazing grass. Not only is that a huge sentence, but there's only one comma in that bastard. It's almost impossible to read that aloud without almost getting a collapsed lung. But yeah, that is a slight drawback. And in some ways, similar to Raven Swordsmistress, it's that kind of having to struggle through text that puts me off a little bit. But unlike Raven, I really want to find out what's going on with this series, so I am going to carry on reading it, of course. But yeah, that's one drawback. So when it comes down to rating it, it's going to have to be a 4. Still bloody good, still brilliant ideas, brilliantly conceived. It's just the writing's let it down slightly. It'd be interesting to see if that aspect of it improves as the series goes on. I think the second book was released 2 years after this one, so maybe it will get better. I don't know. Let me know. What do you think? Am I right or am I wrong here? I didn't talk to Brian about that aspect of the book. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear if any of you have read this and what you think about it. Does he always write like that, or is this an early work? I don't know. I haven't researched at all, as usual. But yeah, there we are. Next one. Last one. Okay, my loves. Right, so we come to the very last one, and it's The Mouth of Hell. Full title, A Post-Apocalyptic Zombie Novella. So yes, it's a novella. It's relatively short. Took me 2 days to get through this. And it's by Will Waw. So as I said at the beginning, he often comments on my videos, and we've become friends, if you will. Been emailing a bit. And I knew just from the way he conducts himself, the way he writes his comments, that, yeah, there's something about this chap. I know he can write, and I knew he was an author. So I sought out this book myself. He didn't approach me and say, oh, can you read this? Can you review it for me? Or anything like that. I just did it myself. I think it's about 80-something pence, something like that. But yeah, I just fancied seeing what he was all about. And I've never read anything that has zombies in it, unless you consider I Am Legend to be that. But the original book obviously was vampires. It wasn't zombies like that terrible Will Smith film. I didn't like it myself. But yeah, so I read this off my own back, and I bloody enjoyed it. Let's just say that from the get-go. It's so well written. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. In fact, the first few pages, the descriptions of these zombies that are just flooding the streets of Manhattan, and have been doing so for a long time, it would seem, are just brilliant. Really, really wonderful. And evocative of the horror that is that scenario. So yeah, what's it about? So it's all from the perspective of this one elderly woman, Beatrice Gonzalez, who's living up in her apartment quite high up, and so she's looking down on this devastated city. And we follow her through perhaps a couple of days, 2 or 3 days of her life, what she observes outside, but also what's going on in her mind. So this is far more than just a zombie story about zombies. The setting is more a vehicle for exploring Beatrice's past, as well as her declining mental state, shall we say. So terrible things have happened in her past. She feels guilt about some of it, I think. And terrible things have happened to her. And it's explored through various scenes. There's lots of chapters in this book, quite short chapters, that explore different aspects of it. And eventually culminates in something Lovecraftian. I mean, this incredible thing happens. But yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the story itself, but I highly recommend reading it. And if I remember, I should do, there'll be a link below if you want to just check it out and read the first part of it, because it's really worth reading. There's a description of this zombie boy at the beginning wearing a cowboy hat that I thought was just incredible. It's like Stephen King at his best in that regard. The rest of the story is wonderfully written. It's incredibly written, I would say, but it doesn't follow a typical path. Now, this is something I'm going to say is the one drawback, and that is the framing of this story. So the title suggests, as the title says, it's a post-apocalyptic zombie novella. There's also a tiny bit of blurb that he's included, which I'll read to you now. A surreal reinvention of the zombie genre, correct? Trapped in a sea of gnashing teeth, her besieged Manhattan apartment, elderly Beatrice Gonzalez is about to give birth, in reverse, to an apocalyptic monster. I mean, yeah, that's nailed on. That all happens. The only thing I would say is that I think prospective readers, and I've noticed someone there has given a 1-star review, and I think it's because of the framing of what this story is and what the impression of what the reader is going to be getting, because I think I put myself in the same situation in that I read the first few pages like, my Christ, this is incredible. I've not read a zombie. It's like a Walking Dead, that kind of thing. I've never watched that, but I imagine this is what it would be like. But then things start turning on its head, and I found it confusing at first because I thought, well, is it this or is it this? But perhaps that's part of the journey. But I think it's going to it might have put previous readers off just because of that, because of what happens. It becomes very surreal, and it butts up against a scenario that's already surreal. It's already bonkers, isn't it? The idea that the world has ended and there's zombies flying around everywhere. By the way, the description of the tidal aspect of these zombies that are just running hell for leather up and down the streets is wonderful. But yeah, but what the story does is brilliant. I just think that the zombie aspect of it, or signposting it as a zombie story, kind of detracts or affects what the story actually does attempt to do. But it's very hard to pigeonhole these kind of books, isn't it? Because essentially it is set within a post-apocalyptic world, within the zombie subgenre of horror. It does contain Lovecraftian aspects. That side of it, actually, that was the only other thing as well. Because of everything that happens, the skewed sense of perspective that she has, because there's something going on with her mind. I wasn't even sure if what happened near the end, this monster aspect, was even happening. You know, I wasn't sure how much she was imagining and how much was real. But anyway, I don't want this to sound as though it's a bad review, because it isn't. It's absolutely not. Let's get the devil down. So yeah, it misses the 5-star just because of that part of it. But other than that, if you come to the story knowing that it's not just zombies, it's not a zombie survival story or anything like that. If you come to it with an open mind, it's really great. So I'm going to give it 4 stars, if you don't mind, Will. I mean, it's not casting any shade on your writing at all, or what you've crafted, because it's brilliant. It's more the framing, I suppose. But there we are. That's my opinion. Yeah, I would check it out if you can, if you would like to. Yeah, and it makes me want to read more zombie stuff, and also makes me want to read more of his writing, because he can write, damn it. Yeah, actually, I was going to say at the beginning, I started reading in bed next to my partner. We read before we go to sleep. I read longer. She reads a few pages and she's out like a light. I'm like, I could go for hours. That's the only thing I can do for hours in the bed. I read a few pages and I just stopped and I went, this guy can write. Because I said, I'm reading this guy's self-published book. And I think anyone that reads self-published, we're all tarnished by the same brush, tarred by the same brush, whatever you call it. There's that perception that it may not be that good. But yeah, wow, this needs to have a publisher attached to it, or does it? I think it's just a brilliant example of how good self-published stuff can be. Anyway, let's leave it there for now. I'm afraid this is probably going to be a very long one, isn't it? But thanks for bearing with me this long and watching to the end, to the bitter end if you have. I'm going to go into the other room now and drink some cold water because it's hotter than hell in here. Anyway, cheerio, my loves, and see you next week. Cheerio.